Andrew, welcome to the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. It's so great to meet you.
Well, it's wonderful to be invited. I'm so delighted that thanks to COVID, we can now manage this 12,000 mile distance between us.
Yes, we can.
I mean, it's changed everything, hasn't it? The Zoom revolution.
It really has.
So it's wonderful, and I've been so impressed with reading your marvelous The Practitioner's Guide to the Science of Psychotherapy. So it's since my initial chat with Richard. So it's been a very exciting week for me. So thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm thrilled.
Oh, that was lovely. You've given a plug for our book before we've been able to even plug yours, because.
But your book is only just out in March, wasn't it? It's not that.
That's right.
No,
that's right. So, and in England, so in England, America in March, England in April, and Australia is actually already out of stock. So
well, I'm not surprised. But I mean, all our many. Academies of psychotherapy will want copies of this. I mean, it's crucial for training purposes. So
please go outside and say that very loudly.
Well, I'm certainly going to. I'm going to be recommending this to all my colleagues.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. But let us talk about your book in this really interesting subject that just grabbed my attention. I mean, look at me. I'm 1,000 years old. But the midlife crisis, that area of but more just midlife. You go beyond just talking about the obvious, and I'm working. We're going to have an article, a section, some sections for it in the magazine, and your adventure back into the history, into the build-up. You're talking about even going back into mythology.
We're going back Freud to Homer. We're going all the way back to the very first text we have, the Odyssey, which is a great midlife story.
Yes, wow. People have been doing this forever. So, I mean, we're talking about it and we're getting more. But please tell us what was really that drew you around? Was this a great passion? Were you directed with by a publisher? Were they opt you? What was a bit of the story that brought it to it? And again, this approach where you've taken it from such a long bow you've drawn through history.
Well, when I was in my late 40s, I'd been running my own business for about 25 years, and I had a late third child, and and when we had our baby in my late 40s, our third daughter, I got incredibly tired. I was working terribly hard, and I had a kind of I suppose a breakdown. One day I couldn't get out of bed, and for 3 months I was sort of polaxed by, and I thought, I don't want to go on doing just this for the rest of my life. And that was when I decided. I'd had about 20 years psychotherapy with a wonderful woman called Hella Adler, who'd been herself analyzed by Jung, and that had a great impression on me. But she'd always said I was far too old to practice, to train. Anyway, aged 50, I started training, and it was turned out to be an 8-year training. And I also did an MA on psychotherapy, and my dissertation was on the midlife crisis, because I had this material. I'd kept lots of notes and dream accounts, and it was. So the only reason I became a psychotherapist was my own midlife crisis. And
I'm with you. I'm the same. Matt is but a mere youngster.
That's the great. I mean, Hella Adler, my wonderful therapist. I finished with her at when she was 92. She retired at 98 and died at 102. And wow. I used to go and spend a marvelous hour with her, but often she'd fall asleep. And at the end of the session, I'd have to shake her and say, "Hello, here's the money." And so the longevity of psychotherapists is terribly attractive when you're 50 and you think, well, God, I've got an extra 20 years to a potential career. Anyway, so that was it. And I'm a great devotee of Jung, and I've been out to Kuznets, and I visited the Bollingen Tower and met his grandchildren and was shown around the tower. And he had this 4-year massive midlife crisis. And I document that in the book, because and that's when he started writing about it. And it made him as a man. And indeed, Freud had a similar midlife crisis from about 1915 to 1920, when he just, everything changed. And he, as I say in the book, he wrote Beyond the Pleasure Principle as he came out of this period of devastating loss. He lost his daughter. So many of his friends had been killed in the war, First World War, and he wrote Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which completely changed his view on how human beings are driven. And then I'm a huge fan of Lincoln and FDR, who I've always read biographies of them, and they had these colossal midlife crises and turned themselves into these remarkable individuals who gave humanity such a tremendous service. And it's true also of Gandhi, who had, when he was 49, he had a midlife crisis, and Mandela, he went to Robben Island and had a terrible time when in the first part of his incarceration. And this kind of experience has a transformatory effect, and it increases the ethical presence and the stature of people like that. And we need, my God, we need people like that at the moment, and there aren't many about. I mean,
because there's a lot of exhaustion in the modern world, brought about by many things, but mostly by the excessive display of conflict that we have, and the lack of engagement in engagement and in cooperation. And so I think that the great healers, the great connectors, are very difficult. It's very difficult for them to emerge at the moment. What do you think?
Well, I quite agree with you. I say in the end of the book that I think we're in the middle of a 200-year species midlife crisis that had started in about 1914, because that from 1914 to 1945 we had 30 years of a level of barbarity unmatched in human history. I mean, you did not want to live, if you were unlucky enough to find yourself in Picardy or Flanders, or between the Vistula in 1914 to 1918, or between the Vistula and the Volga between 1941 and 1945, you were in the worst place at the worst time of history. I mean, and we now see that process is continuing. I mean, with the pandemic and now what's going on in Ukraine, we're still, but this can be a transformatory experience. We've got to give up. We've got to give up economic priorities and strategic military priorities, nationalistic priorities. Otherwise, we'll have a species extinction event. We might, I didn't think I'd be thinking we might have another nuclear exchange, but that's possible now. And we certainly, if we're going to be spending our time worrying about wars on the fringes of Eastern Europe, we're not going to be spending our time looking at global warming, and that will get us. Or, of course, AI, artificial intelligence. We had a series of lectures on the BBC by the great expert, I can't remember his name now, who on artificial intelligence. My God, we're going to be in a challenge when that comes up. And the only way to get through these threats of an extinction event is by increasing ethics, global ethics, above nationalism and economics. We've got to be.
I noticed this.
We face.
Yeah, because what was particularly, Matt, I know you've got something there, but I just quickly grabbing on what I loved about the story of Jung and of Freud, besides the fact that it took us back into the historic developments of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, and which was directly related to therapists and what they're interested in. But it's also a metaphor or analogy or an example or a case study of this dramatic sort of transformational change, where Freud basically said, "Oh my God, everything I've set up to now is wrong, or inappropriate, or not as appropriate," and rewrote, as did with Jung. And this is what you seem to be suggesting here. We need to actually, something needs to jerk us up, saying, "Oh my God, we've got it wrong."
Well, what Jung believed in, he had a tremendous belief in this concept of enantiodromia, which is a Heraclitean term from the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, that when a position, a system or individual has a position which is fixed on, let's say, on the horizontal axis, when it loosens itself and it will go to the extreme. And he says that's what human beings do. And that's what the midlife crisis does. It's an enantiodromic experience, and the world will, and the species will do that. What happens on the micro level will happen on the macro level. If it doesn't, we won't survive as a species. So we've got to make this change and get away from, I mean, nationalism is over as a viable way of organizing our political life globally. And in many ways, the pandemic showed that. And I think the sheer solidarity in the West, and I wish India would join, and possibly China. I mean, you just cannot behave how Putin is behaving at the moment. It's unacceptable.
Yeah.
And so this is an enantiodromic moment when we have to change the paradigm. It's a paradigm shift from the way we look at the world. But that has to happen at the individual level, and a cadre of individuals who can become the Mandelas and the Gandhis and the Lincolns of the day take on the historical challenge, and they will emerge, I think.
So let's so assuming the micro does reflect the macro, let's bring it back then to an individual level, and let's tease out a little bit more about how a midlife crisis becomes, as you say, humanity's secret weapon. Can we just sort of extrapolate a little bit on what that means?
Well, the idea is that if I can just read something Jung wrote when he was asked whether there'd be a third world war. This is in his very famous face-to-face interview, which is available on YouTube and is a must for anybody who's interested in going into this phase. He in this interview, he was asked by John Freeman, who interviewed all these world figures, and he went out to Kuznets to make the interview because Jung was the year before he died.
So
and John Freeman
asked,
this is 1958.
1958, okay.
60, and he died in 61.
Right.
And Freeman asked him, looking at the world today, this is 3 years before the Cuban Missile Crisis, looking at the world today, do you feel that a third world war is likely? Jung answered, we are so full of apprehension and fear that one doesn't know exactly what it points to. But one thing is sure, we need more psychology. We need more understanding of human nature, because the only real danger that exists is man himself. He is the great danger, and we're pitifully unaware of it. We know nothing of man, far too little. His psyche should be studied, because we are the origin of all coming evil. Now, in a sense, that's very prescient, because nobody, I mean, most of my three daughters and most of their generation all have psychotherapists now. Psychotherapy is a mass activity. And so we are learning more and more about the psyche. Your book, I mean, what we were saying before the podcast started, the understanding of epigenetics, it might mean that we can understand the problems in the Russian psyche after the terrible 100 years they've had. They're so traumatized that it's very understandable that they should be so paranoid. And I think that basically we are, because it's almost part of an evolutionary process, we are becoming more aware of our psyche and the shadow and what happens in projection. And so as the critical mass of individual experience occurs, and we're all so busy, and the pandemic has speeded up this process. I don't know about you, but are people queuing around the block after the pandemic for psychotherapy? I mean, we've never been busier.
Yes. So yeah, there's an overwhelming need.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's also the understanding of the need for what. I mean, it's
the development drive with individuals. I'm sure that's basically what Jung says in his theory of individuation.
Yeah. That
the purpose of life is to develop. That's why we're here. We're here to go through a series of transitional phases that turn us from children to adolescents to eventually wise elders, because it is the wise elders that, as I say in the book, that nurse the culture through the traumas that the warrior class cause. So again, I'm slightly getting away from the individual experience, but I think there's a tremendous overlap between the two. And
yeah.
Yes, I think what really is so much inherent in what you're saying is there's grand opportunities for change at times in life. I mean, there is also a discussion about a development that occurs around the age of 30.
Well, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
And
no about that. I mean, using the metaphor of astrology, which probably isn't empirically verifiable, first Saturn return. Have you come across that?
Right. Yes,
Yeah.
I had a long relationship with someone involved in astrology, and the pattern of it, I think, is very relevant.
Well, it's a metaphor that is it works quite well. Yes.
And it's looking at that, the therapist sitting in their rooms with someone, perhaps at their 30s, but that's this time we're talking about the midlife, in looking at the opportunity that this dilemma, this crisis, that the client is sitting there saying, "Oh my God, I don't know what to do. I've left my life." I mean, my simple example: I thought I would have no midlife crisis because I was an actor. I was doing what I wanted. I had a little inheritance. Everything was wonderful. But I got to my midlife crisis, and I suddenly discovered that I wasn't famous, and that the acting work was dropping away. And it was a time of enormous change. It was unbelievable, and I've ended up here, which is the most wonderful outcome. So this thing, Andrew, just talking about that therapist sitting there looking at the person opposite them, how it's
the gift in the wound. And I find there's, again, as you probably know, second Saturn return is 60s. You've got the midlife crisis. You've got the adjustment at 30, and then when you're finally making it into adulthood and taking on responsibilities, you've then got the midlife crisis somewhere in the 40s or 50s, and then you've got the second Saturn return. And I find I get a lot of people in their late 50s, early 60s, and once they've been through that process, what happens is, I call it bringing in the harvest. They have a tremendous 60s, as clearly you're having, when they're incredibly productive, incredibly energetic, because they've got rid of their complexes and their neuroses that they've spent so much of their energy and time expended on. And so basically, the Chinese pictogram for crisis is exactly the same as the Chinese pictogram for opportunity. So, a midlife crisis is a gift. But you've got to find the right assets. And this is something that Winnicott writes about. He says that we somehow find the assets that allow us, the emotional support that allow us to cope and re-experience what he calls our primitive agonies from our early childhood. Yeah. And psychotherapy is a wonderful vehicle for this. And I mean, it's so moving watching people transform themselves from who are desperately trying to find ways of dealing with the difficulties they face. And as they work through this traumatic material, this new higher self emerges. I mean, the complexes and neuroses never go completely, but we are able to sort of bear them in a different way.
So, Matt, this is what we talk about with client resources, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. What I wanted to just comment on here is that the midlife crisis isn't always, it doesn't always turn out to be, the great opportunity. And so can you speak to some of the things that don't go that way?
Yeah. Do we blow?
Well, I think alcoholism is a terribly difficult thing to cope with in midlife, because and I find most alcoholic, I have perhaps an 80% success rate with people with midlife crises, but with alcoholics, I have a 20% success rate. I think, and the same would be true of drug addiction. There's something particularly pernicious about how alcoholics, their need is so great that they have a very, very flexible relationship with the truth. And I've almost got to a stage where I'm only prepared to work with people who've gone to AA or some kind of rehabilitation, because you become, as a therapist, part of the kind of the inability to ever say what's really happening. I mean, because alcoholics, I mean, I always feel that recovering alcoholics are some of the most amazing people I come across. And they seem to have a kind of enlightenment because they've dealt with something so difficult.
Yes, yes, and this nature of what I'm hearing is the people are coming with the crisis, they're coming with the things falling apart, but it's almost like the therapist, the task of the therapist is just to help them to look at it in a different direction, to say, okay, that framework, that foundation is falling away, but what is it for? What is it revealing? Is this the task the therapist can add to the process?
Well, I think basically it's a question of hand-holding through the crisis. You become a fellow traveler, and if you've been through the crisis yourself, you're familiar with the terrain, and you may not have the answers. And in a sense, it's not for the therapist to provide the answers. It's merely to be there, holding the client. I mean, I think boundaries have to be much looser when you're working with somebody who's, like I say, if somebody's really at the heart of a crisis, and it's almost killing them, you have to make yourself available. I mean, I saw somebody yesterday who rang me on Sunday. It was a bank holiday in England yesterday, and he'd had a terrible weekend with his parents and was totally traumatized. And so seeing him on a bank holiday, and then I'll see him each day this week. It has to. You have to go a further mile at those moments of crisis. The big moment when I had my crisis was when my therapist said, Hella Adler said, "You can ring me any time of night and day." Now, that I never did take up that option. I mean, I was talking to her every day, but I never rang her at an inconvenient time. But it was a gesture that meant so much to me. I felt so held by that, as though, and I think, our very inflexible boundaries need to be put to one side here, to some degree. I mean, yes, Winnicott took people on holiday with him in crisis. He had people to live with him. I mean, and Jung would take people in crisis on his sail with them on his boat. There's something about compassion and the human to human experience at these moments of huge intimacy, where we need to not constantly think about the rules of psychotherapy.
And I mean, because I was thinking about the memory reconsolidation. I mean, this opens us up for that. What do you think? Thoughts there, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if there's this window that's open for memory reconsolidation, within what is it? Is about a 6-hour window.
Yeah, 4 to 6.
And if you're there, in a sort of continually with the client, seeing them through that, you'll see that consolidation happening if you keep them in the right state of mind. I was going to make just going to make a comment that we are trained very well these days to have very solid boundaries, from making sure that doesn't happen, those sort of, connections. And so, I mean, I guess each school is different in how they approach that. But I think generally a lot of therapists would agree that they're trained to be quite separate in that respect. They keep very strict hours, and you don't allow clients to incur, upon your other private life and time.
Yeah, the human being comes in and just interferes with our excellently laid plans.
Our business.
That's the thing, isn't it? Our business plans.
Yeah, but are you saying we need to absolutely maintain these very strict boundaries at all times?
Oh,
or
no.
Do you feel there are
No, I'm saying that our training should take into account what you've just said, and be a lot more flexible.
well, I'm very pleased you say that. I absolutely agree with you. And these are exceptional occasions. I mean, you can't go on like that for month after month. But at the crucial moment, you are such an important fashioner of the future of the person who's sitting in front of you. Can I just ask you about this? Are you saying that you actually have sessions that run much longer into 4 or 5 hours? Is that what you were?
It's very rare. The profession doesn't allow it. Now, I had a very strange, an unusual apprenticeship with Ernest Rossi, who came out of the experience with Milton Erickson, where certainly an hour and a half is almost minimum. You know, I hardly ever do less than that. But I have some clients, very few, because a lot of people are able to take what you say in a session and go away and work with that. And it takes them, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7 days to actually process all the material. But I do have a particular client who, just as you were saying, Andrew, with the one that you've got coming in now, has got this immediate problem, that I allow texts at any time. Text, I don't, the phone calls, I can't arrange that. And so there's almost daily. And I'm sitting here in my metaphor for her experience, and it's midlife, but it's confused with a lot of other, you know, complexities. But the metaphor is that she's in a car with 2 pedals, and she only really knows and feels comfortable pressing one of those pedals, which unfortunately happens to be the brake. And I keep saying to her, you've just got to press the accelerator. It's the only way you're going to go. And she presses the brake harder. So it is that persistent. So I feel we're at the turning point, this breaking point that you also talk about, that it gets more and more intense towards this point. Erickson talked about that when she does slip her foot over to the accelerator, it's going to be so exciting. It's going to be fabulous.
Yes, that's a marvelous analogy. I'm going to plagiarize that with my
okay.
and the book. It's a wonderful metaphor.
Yeah.
I wrote a paper that I gave last year to the C.G. Jung Society of Bristol on what I call therapeutic love. Ultimately, what these individuals are looking for at these key moments is love, and that has to have some sort of unconditionality about it. I think the whole concept of love is a hugely problematic issue for our profession, because there's the whole erotic transference and countertransference problem. But I think basically, Shandor Ferencik wrote about it very movingly in his therapeutic diaries, how he was the first therapist in the 30s writing about this, saying that what all our clients really want is love, the love they didn't get from their parents. And I feel when I'm doing an assessment and deciding whether to take on a client, I've got to sort of feel that I could really love this person. I mean, not in any erotic fashion, obviously that's completely out of the question. But you know, the difference between agape and eros. Yeah. Agape being the kind of parental love, and that's really what I feel we're in the business of reparenting so often, and basically it's like as if they're pressing the iPlayer button to get the experience that they should have had at 6 months, a year, and getting it when they're 50. And so you know, I think it's reading your book, what really interests me, do you mind if I just move on to this, because this is all relevant?
That's delightful. Yeah, please talk about us.
Well, I think it's so important. As you know, I got all Cozzolino's books here, yes. Which the fact that you're a friend of his, he's one of my great heroes. So I was thrilled to hear that you know him personally. But he made a tremendous impact, and he's mentioned in the book that we're kind of neurologizing psychotherapy, and he famously says that that psychotherapists are now applied psychology, and you take that even further in this marvelously comprehensive account of of the way neurology and psychotherapy and now genetics all merge, and we're all. But the one thing, do you know a book that's been tremendously important in the UK and America? Do you know the Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master in His Emissary?
No, never heard of him before.
Never heard of him.
Oh, you have? Oh,
No.
Matt is our expert there. He's doing a lot of work and actually writing a number of things. So Matt, please.
Did you know Ian
McGilchrist
used to be on our board at the very beginning in 2013.
Well, my God, you're so well connected.
But then he decided to write that book, and so we never heard from him again.
Yes, he got a bit famous for us.
You mean the book that he's just written and published, which is in about 3 volumes? It took him about 10 years.
Yes.
Was this the book he was writing?
Oh, the first one,
No.
yes. Once that came out, he just became too busy. That was all.
This
stuff.
Well, there we are. Oh yes, that's the new one. Yes. But I haven't had time to look at that. But The Master and His Emissary, of course, looks at the neurological parallels between the right brain and the left brain, and so and of course, what neurology is primarily doing is looking at left brain empirical rational pragmatism, which is based upon hard data that we get from MRI scans and brain autopsies and all the other work that you're involved in. But the right brain, which he says needs much more balance with the left brain because we live in such a rational, pragmatist, empirical culture, he wants the intuitive and the soulful to have its place. And Brené Brown's probably somebody you have on your show, who I like very much. Yes. But her axiom, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Yes, and I just wonder whether this interface between the very scientific rational pragmatism and the intuitive soulful, bearing in mind that psychotherapy means psyche, the soul, therapy to heal. Do you have any concept of those right brain human longings that and how do they fit into the scientific model?
Well, absolutely.
I'll just make a quick comment before you come in, Matt, with that, because you're the expert there. But just when we talk about science, and we take a bit of effort with in some of the book, but also in some essays we've written afterwards, to move away to say science has been stolen. And it's been given a different semantic definition, which is a great error. So bring the reductionist mechanistic thing is a new form of saying what science is. Science is really about the knowledge of and the investigation of, and so that's what that's the way we approach the term.
And in many ways, quantum mechanics has followed that line.
That's
I mean,
right.
as Niels Bohr said, you can only talk about the quantum world using poetry and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The empiricism doesn't work in quantum mechanics, and I think it's true to some degree in our field, and I think there are certain similarities between depth psychology and quantum mechanics.
Well, that's the right brain stuff, Matt, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, quantum mechanics is a bit of an oxymoron, isn't it? Because we can't use a machine metaphor to describe what we're discovering in the quantum realm, and similarly when it comes to human behavior, we have this 200-year history of applying the mechanical, mechanistic metaphor to everything that's organic and biological, which doesn't work. Where things that flow and live are not machines, but we persist in our machine metaphor, which is the realm of the left hemisphere, which the left hemisphere understands things mechanistically. And so for our perspective is that we come from a curiosity approach. We see the whole person, the whole context, the whole situation, and from there we're able to then utilize the aspects of the left hemisphere that is very skilled in being able to break things down into components, into bits, but then that information is to inform the right hemisphere once again, and so that we have a greater intuition, we have a greater understanding of the whole. And so just as in the Ian McGilchrist book, the master and his emissary, the right hemisphere has to be the master. The information has to come back across to the right hemisphere to have an appreciation of the whole. And the situation that we find ourselves in now is that it remains in the realm of the left hemisphere, and we're very much driven by the left hemisphere. And that is not a state of mind that's going to be helpful in any way in discovering reality. Yeah.
And of course, McGilchrist makes the rather nice, he says that the right hemisphere is dependent on the left hemisphere, who's a kind of high achieving bureaucrat, who's brilliant at getting all the data and giving the facts of the world. Wittgenstein said in his notebooks when he was in the trenches in the First World War, to be religious is to know the facts of the world and not the end of the matter. And I've always liked that quote, that the empirical data we have is not the end of the matter, that something odd going on. And actually there was something, the subtitle of your book, was it the way the mind deals with the brain, or something like that? There was a distinction between mind and brain.
Yes, we certainly do. We certainly do follow that. We continue to talk about the nature of mind. We had fascinating discussions with the microbiologist the other day, with talking about sort of what is it, but we certainly have had a lot of stabs at getting at what it is, to find out what we know is wrong. I mean, it's not just from the brain, because of course then the body and the cells would have no relationship, and they do. And of course then the DNA would have no relationship, but it does. So, and as you're saying, the epigenetics, which change in relation to experience. So therefore, one of the things when we were talking about epigenetics and midlife, as you go through that crisis, you are changing the nature of the way your gene expresses itself, because you are changing the phenotype, the thing that you can see, the thing that you can observe. And for the thing you observe, for Jung to have come out, and Jung, but particularly Freud, to come out and say, I have a complete change of mind and a complete change of attitude, that must have genetic changes as well, and
Absolutely.
gene expression framework. So it really interesting.
Yeah, context. Sorry, I was just going to say context is all important, which if we talk about left brain again, the left brain misses the context. And so when we're talking about,
that's a very good way of putting it. Yeah.
Anything really, we're talking about midlife, crisis and transformation. Context it has everything to do with that. And if you try to isolate the person, I don't know, their psychological makeup,
their environment, all of their history and their potential. So there's a lot to consider when you're looking at that person who is sitting there. And it's difficult when they're in their 40s or so sometimes, and they're saying, oh my God, it's a disaster. It's sort of like, oh, for God's sake, grow up. But that's what's so beautiful about your book. It reminds us that this is not only useful, it's an opportunity, it's a necessary aspect of development.
It's a rite of passage. And of course,
primitive
cultures have formal rites of passage. In Australia, the Aboriginals go walkabout, don't they? Does that still happen? Or it certainly did.
Well, certainly as part of their culture, yes. When they have the opportunity to have freedom, free access to their cultural lands and so on and so forth.
And in India, the sannyasins leave their family after they brought up their children and become sort of holy men wandering around. And we don't have those rites of passage. We just say, well, you start your career when you're 22 and you can finish when you're 70. I mean, life is too precious. Time is too precious to spend it all doing the same thing for the entire life. I just wanted to read something that Jung wrote from Memory Streams and Reflections, which seemed to me a complete description of epigenetics. Can I just read this paragraph?
Oh, please, yes.
I feel very strongly that I'm under the influence of things or questions which were left incomplete and unanswered by my parents and grandparents, more distant ancestors. It often seems as though there is an impersonal karma within a family, which is passed on from parents to children. It has always seemed to me that I had to answer these questions which fate had posed previous generations and which had not yet been answered or left unfinished. And that seems to me I mean, how do you feel? Is that what we're trying to do?
It's a beautiful description, as we were also, we were saying before when we were chatting. Epigenetics is just, we've found a description, we found a behavior, we found an element of what's going on within the system. We've been able to differentiate ourselves down to this microscopic level. But Jung is showing us there, if you were a keen observer and a sensitive observer, you could see it. And you can actually, I can't recall them, but I'm remembering some of the sections in Shakespeare. And then you go back to the atomists, back in Grecian times. People could see it, they just didn't know what it was. Now we have a better idea, and that's the key.
Yes. I had a client whose great-grandfather and his three brothers all died on the Battle of the Somme, first day of the Somme, and her great-grandmother, her grandmother, her mother, and then her in her midlife crisis, saw all their relationships with men through the sense of loss. That this terrible trauma that happened to this family, where an entire generation of men were wiped out in a morning, 100 years later, it was still impacting on this poor woman. And because she could only see men through the lens of inevitable loss. And all these previous generations of women had lost their husbands through early death or divorce or desertion. And she would find a way of ending relationships so she would be left and would experience a sense of loss. And of course, that's classic Freudian repetition theory, which is that we constantly are drawn by the things we're most familiar to. That's what we want to follow, rather than something that's curative and developmental.
And that thing of what makes things familiar, and this extraordinary aspect that obviously an epigenetic, which is a memory of experience, doesn't remember in events. It doesn't remember in those sorts of things that we do in cognitive. Yet that biological, that biopsychosocial milieu manifests in our conscious awareness these similar types of event type based things. It's quite extraordinary how it's all tied in.
Yeah, and I think that we're going to find that memory is not just an epigenetic memory affecting brain regions for memory, that it's going to be a whole body memory. We've talked to people, about the memory of the cell. There's the memory and the neural architecture of the heart. This is a whole body thing that we're talking about.
Exactly. Yes. That book, The Body Keeps the Score. Well, I mean, you use that. It does. I mean, the body is a far more reliable response system to our psychology, isn't it? Where we use all our defenses to hide behind, but the body, it all comes out in the body.
And of course, our trouble is we're too stupid to understand it. As someone said, the only trouble with understanding the brain is that we have to understand it with the brain we've got, and the brain we've got can't understand itself.
But who was it who said that the brain is the most complex article in the universe, the human brain?
Yes, there are a few that have said that indeed. I think Einstein said something of that nature.
Well, Andrew, as we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, anybody who might be listening to this who's going through a midlife crisis, it is the portal, the entry into a new way of life that will serve you very well in the years to come. So you may find it very tough, and I hope you've got a good psychotherapist and a partner or a number of people who are going to support you during this difficult time. But it is where you're going to find a tremendous redemptive experience that will allow you a very interesting, fulfilling and rewarding last half of the life. I can't recommend the midlife crisis more thoroughly.
Well, on that incredibly positive note and inspiring note for a lot of people who are sitting out there feeling a little going crazy in their midlife, it's not. It's a valuable crazy. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us and talking about your
very
work.
much. I'm terribly touched that I should be talking to an audience in Australia. It's wonderful that the Zoom culture has allowed this to happen. So, and I hope I can't wait for Amazon to deliver the book, and I'm going to be doing a big sales pitch to all my friends. I think it's a remarkable achievement. So many congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrew.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.